The winter of 1412 descended upon the English countryside with the silence of a held breath. Snow fell in delicate spirals over the stone towers of Ashworth Castle, settling upon battlements and frosted window panes like the whispered prayers of forgotten saints. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and frozen earth, threading through the bare branches of ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of lords rise and fall beneath their patient shadows. Within the great hall, fires roared in hearths large enough to shelter a standing man, yet the warmth could not reach the cold that had settled into the heart of Lord Edward Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ashworth. He stood before the blazing flames, his back to the assembly of nobles who had gathered like carrion birds awaiting the fall of greater prey. The firelight cast his shadow long and dark across the rushes strewn upon the stone floor, and in that elongated silhouette, one might have read the shape of defiance itself. At 30 years of age, Edward possessed the bearing of a man who had learned early that power was both privilege and prison. His features were carved with the precision of his Norman ancestors, a strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds before thunder, and hands that knew equally the weight of a sword and the delicacy of a quill. He had led men into battle against the French, had negotiated treaties that preserved his lands through the turbulence of a kingdom divided, and had buried both parents before his 25th year. Yet none of these trials had prepared him for the decree that now lay upon the oak table behind him, its royal seal glinting like a wound in the candlelight. The king commands it. The voice belonged to Lord Pemberton, the royal emissary, a man whose thin lips seemed designed for the delivery of unwelcome news. Lady Catherine of Norwich is to become your duchess before the spring thaw. The alliance will strengthen the crown's position in the eastern territories. Edward did not turn. His gaze remained fixed upon the flames, watching the dance of destruction and warmth, creation and consumption locked in eternal embrace. Lady Catherine, he repeated, and the name fell from his lips like a stone into still water. Whose father burned 3 villages to claim a disputed border? Whose brother stands accused of crimes against peasant women that would make the devil himself look away in shame? Accusations without proof, Lord Pemberton interjected smoothly. And irrelevant to the matter at hand. Your Grace, the king does not ask, he commands. The logs in the hearth cracked and shifted, sending a shower of sparks spiraling upward into the blackened chimney. Edward watched them rise and vanish, brief lives extinguished in the darkness above. Then you may return to His Majesty, Edward said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and found it less frightening than compromise, and inform him that the Duke of Ashworth will choose his own bride, as his father did, and his father before him. The Blackwood line has served the crown for 300 years, but we have never sold our souls for political convenience. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles like wind through wheat. Lord Pemberton's face flushed with barely concealed fury, but Edward had already turned, and his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had seen the blood of Agincourt stain foreign soil, swept across the gathering with the weight of absolute certainty. This audience is concluded. The words hung in the air as Edward strode from the hall, his boots echoing against stone worn smooth by centuries of Blackwood footsteps. Behind him, the fire crackled and the nobles whispered, and somewhere in the castle's labyrinthine corridors, a servant girl pressed herself into the shadows of an alcove, her dark skin invisible in the darkness, her heart racing with the knowledge of what she had overheard. Her name was Eleanor, and she had been born 23 winters past in a small village on the African coast, a place of warmth and color and songs that still haunted her dreams. Taken by Portuguese traders when she was barely 7 years of age, sold in Lisbon to a merchant who sold her again to an English nobleman traveling abroad, she had passed through hands like a coin of unusual denomination until fate, or perhaps something kinder, had brought her to Ashworth Castle 5 years ago. Here, in the vast kitchens and endless corridors of the Duke's ancestral home, Eleanor had found something she had not dared to hope for since childhood: a measure of peace. The head cook, a formidable woman named Martha who judged people by their work ethic rather than their origins, had taken her under protection. The other servants, after initial curiosity, had accepted her quiet presence as simply another element of the castle's ancient rhythm. But Eleanor carried secrets that not even Martha knew. She could read, a skill taught to her by a kind priest in Lisbon who had seen in her eyes an intelligence that transcended the circumstances of her birth. She could write, forming letters with a grace that belied her calloused hands. And she possessed a memory that captured conversations, dates, and details with the precision of a royal scribe. These gifts she kept hidden, understanding instinctively that in a world where her very existence was considered property, knowledge was the only wealth she could safely possess. Now pressed against the cold stone of the alcove, Eleanor listened as Lord Pemberton's voice rose in outraged conference with his attendants. "The Duke refuses. He actually refuses the King's command. What shall we do, my lord? We return to London. We inform His Majesty of this insult. And then—" A pause, heavy with implication. "Then we shall see how long the Duke of Ashworth can maintain his defiance when the full weight of the crown descends upon him." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had served in this castle long enough to understand the precarious balance of medieval politics, the way alliances shifted like sand and favor could turn to persecution overnight. The Duke, her Duke, for in her heart she had long harbored feelings she dared not name, had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in England. And she, a poor black maid with nothing to her name but her hidden knowledge and her unspoken love, could do nothing but watch as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon. 3 weeks passed like the slow turning of pages in an illuminated manuscript. Snow continued to fall upon Ashworth lands, blanketing the villages and fields in white silence, and in the great castle, life continued with the rhythm of ancient routine. Servants rose before dawn to stoke fires and prepare bread. Knights trained in the frozen courtyard, their breath rising in clouds as steel rang against steel. And the Duke of Ashworth went about his duties with the calm determination of a man who had made his choice and would not waver. Eleanor watched him when she could, stealing glances from beneath lowered lashes as she served meals in the great hall or carried linens through corridors where he happened to walk. She had memorized the cadence of his footsteps, the particular way he held his shoulders when burdened by thought, the rare occasions when something, a jest from his steward, a child's laughter in the courtyard, would soften the stern lines of his face into something approaching warmth. She knew these observations were dangerous. A servant did not look upon her master with such attention. A woman of her station did not dream of a duke's smile. And yet Eleanor could not stop the current of her heart, any more than she could halt the turning of the seasons. It was on a Thursday morning, when frost painted flowers upon every window and the castle's breath seemed suspended in crystalline stillness, that everything changed. Eleanor had been assigned to clean the Duke's private study, a task that fell to her monthly, and which she both anticipated and dreaded. The room smelled of parchment and ink, of the dried lavender sachets that the Duke's late mother had placed in every chamber, and beneath it all, something indefinable that was simply him. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, Latin texts, French poetry, histories of ancient Rome, treatises on agriculture and law and philosophy. Eleanor had spent precious stolen moments running her fingers along their spines, imagining worlds beyond the one that circumstance had built around her. She was dusting the great oak desk, her movements careful around the scattered papers and the silver inkwell that had belonged to the first Duke of Ashworth, when she heard the commotion, raised voices in the corridor, the clatter of armed men, and then the door burst open, revealing Lord Pemberton flanked by 6 soldiers bearing the King's livery. "The Duke of Ashworth is hereby placed under arrest," Pemberton announced, his thin smile carrying the satisfaction of a man savoring delayed revenge. "By order of His Majesty, for the crime of refusing a royal command." Behind the soldiers, Eleanor saw the Duke being led in chains. His face remained impassive, that noble mask she had observed so many times, but in his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that haunted her dreams, she saw the flicker of something she had never witnessed before: resignation. Not to defeat, but to destiny. Their gazes met. For one impossible moment, the Duke of Ashworth looked directly at the servant girl who stood frozen with a dusting cloth in her trembling hands. And in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the vast gulf of their stations. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits trapped in circumstances neither had chosen. Then the soldiers pulled him forward, and Lord Pemberton's cold voice echoed through the chamber. "Search the castle. Seize all documents. The Duke's treasonous correspondence must be found and presented at his trial." Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew, as perhaps no one else in the castle knew, that in the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf, the Duke kept letters from allies who shared his resistance to the king's overreach, letters that, if discovered, would transform a charge of defiance into a charge of conspiracy, letters that would mean his execution. The soldiers began their search with the efficiency of men well practiced in destruction. Books were pulled from shelves, their pages rifled through and discarded. Tapestries were torn from walls. Furniture was overturned, and the crash of breaking wood filled the air like the sounds of a siege. Eleanor stood motionless, her mind racing faster than her heart. She had perhaps moments before they reached the bookshelf with its secret compartment. Moments before the evidence was discovered. Moments before the Duke of Ashworth's fate was sealed. She thought of her mother, whom she had last seen as a child of 7, standing on an African shore with tears streaming down her face. She thought of the priest in Lisbon who had taught her to read, who had whispered that God's purpose for her was greater than she could imagine. She thought of the Duke's eyes meeting hers, of the unspoken connection that had sparked between them like flint striking steel. And then Eleanor did something that would change the course of 2 lives forever. She fainted. Or rather, she appeared to faint, crumpling to the floor with a cry that drew every eye in the room. Her body struck the stones with enough force to produce genuine pain, but her mind remained sharp, calculating. The soldiers paused. Lord Pemberton turned with irritation. "Remove this servant," he commanded. "She is in the way." 2 soldiers moved toward her, and Eleanor allowed herself to be lifted, her body limp, her eyes fluttering as though consciousness remained just beyond her grasp. They carried her toward the door, and as they passed the bookshelf, the fateful bookshelf with its hidden compartment, Eleanor's hand reached out, seemingly in the involuntary movement of a fainting woman grasping for support. Her fingers found the mechanism she had discovered months ago while cleaning. A slight pressure, a barely audible click, and the compartment opened just enough for her to slip her hand inside, to grasp the bundle of letters, to tuck them into the bodice of her rough wool dress. No one saw. The soldiers were focused on their search. Lord Pemberton was directing his men toward the desk, and Eleanor, carried from the room like a piece of inconvenient furniture, held against her heart the evidence that could condemn or save a duke. They deposited her in the servants' corridor, and the moment their footsteps faded, Eleanor rose. Her hands trembled as she touched the letters hidden beneath her dress. The paper was fine, the wax seals bearing crests of noble houses she recognized from her years of silent observation. Each letter was a death warrant. Each letter was also perhaps the key to a locked door. She had to hide them. She had to think. She had to decide what to do with power she had never sought and could not keep. But first, she had to survive the next hour without being discovered. Eleanor moved through the castle with the invisibility that came naturally to servants, seen but not noticed, present but overlooked. She passed clusters of soldiers ransacking chambers, stepped around piles of destroyed furniture, and kept her face carefully blank even as her heart pounded against the stolen secrets pressed to her breast. She found refuge in the root cellar beneath the kitchens, a cold and earthy space where the castle's winter vegetables were stored. Here, amid barrels of turnips and hanging braids of onions, Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe. She withdrew the letters with shaking hands. The first was from the Earl of Northumberland, expressing support for the Duke's position and suggesting a gathering of like-minded nobles come spring. The second came from a baron in the Welsh marches, offering troops should the conflict with the crown escalate. The third letter stopped Eleanor's breath entirely. It was addressed not to the Duke of Ashworth, but from him. A draft, it seemed, of correspondence never sent, and its contents spoke not of politics or armies, but of something far more personal. "I find myself unable to sleep. the Duke had written in a hand that Eleanor had come to recognize from documents she had handled during her cleaning duties. My thoughts return always to a pair of dark eyes that I have no right to notice. She moves through my halls like a shadow of grace, this servant whose name I learned only by asking the cook when propriety demanded I not ask at all. Eleanor. The name sits upon my tongue like a foreign wine, exotic, forbidden, and impossibly sweet. Eleanor's hands trembled so violently that the paper shook. I am a duke, the letter continued. My blood is the blood of conquerors, my name inscribed in the histories of kingdoms. And yet I find myself humbled before this woman whose origins the world would call lowly, whose station forbids me even the courtesy of direct address. I watch her, and I am watched in return. I have seen it, felt it, those moments when our eyes meet across the crowded hall and something unnamed passes between us. I cannot marry Lady Catherine, not merely because her family represents everything I despise in the corruption of nobility, but because my heart, that organ which my father always warned me a duke must keep firmly governed, has already chosen. It has chosen impossibly. It has chosen her. The letter ended there, unsigned, unfinished. A confession meant for no eyes but its author's, never intended to be sent. Eleanor pressed the paper to her lips, and the tears that fell upon it were warm against the cold of the cellar. He had seen her. He had noticed her. He had, impossible, miraculous, terrifying, felt for her what she had felt for him. And now he was in chains, facing trial for treason, and she held in her hands the evidence that could condemn him and the proof of a love she had never dared to imagine could be reciprocated. The sound of boots above stirred Eleanor from her revelation. The soldiers were still searching. She had to act. She tucked the letters back into her bodice, wiped her tears with the rough wool of her sleeve, and climbed the cellar stairs with the beginning of a plan forming in her mind. It was a desperate plan, a dangerous plan, a plan that could see her hanged alongside the Duke she loved. But Eleanor had survived the Middle Passage. She had survived slavery in foreign lands. She had survived years of invisibility in a world that refused to see her as fully human. She would survive this too. And perhaps if fate proved kind, she might save him in the process. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one, stories of impossible love conquering impossible odds, stories that will make your heart believe again, they arrive here every week. Subscribe now, and let us journey together through the shadows toward the light. The Tower of London rose from the banks of the Thames like a monument to the cost of royal displeasure. Its white stone walls had witnessed the fall of princes and the breaking of noble houses, had absorbed the final prayers of men who had once believed themselves invincible. Within its cold chambers, the Duke of Ashworth awaited a trial that all of London assumed would end with his head upon the block. Edward had been given quarters befitting his station, a small room in the Beauchamp Tower, with a narrow window that overlooked the inner ward and a fireplace that provided minimal warmth against the February chill. His jailers treated him with the careful courtesy reserved for those who might yet be vindicated or whose families might yet take revenge. But the iron door that locked each night spoke more honestly of his circumstances. In the fortnight since his arrest, Edward had received no visitors. His steward had been denied entry. His letters to allies had been confiscated before they could be sent. The isolation was deliberate, he knew. A strategy to break his will before the trial, to make him grateful for any mercy offered in exchange for submission. What his captors did not understand was that Edward had spent his life preparing for this moment, not consciously perhaps, but in every book he had read, every battle he had fought, every compromise he had refused when easier men would have bent. He was the son of a line that had never knelt except before God. He would not kneel now. But in the darkest hours of the night, when sleep refused to come, and the guard's footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond his door, Edward's thoughts turned not to politics or principle, but to a pair of dark eyes in a stone corridor. To a servant girl whose name he should not know, whose face he should not remember, whose presence in his mind made the chains upon his wrists feel almost irrelevant. Eleanor. He had written of her once, In a moment of weakness, pouring his forbidden feelings onto paper he had always intended to burn. The letter remained in the hidden compartment of his study, a confession no eyes would ever read. Unless... Edward's blood ran cold as realization struck. The soldiers had searched his study. They had been specifically instructed to find correspondence. If they had discovered the compartment, if they had read the letter, his feelings for Eleanor could be twisted into evidence of moral corruption. A duke harboring tender sentiments for a servant, and not merely any servant, but an African woman whose presence in England was itself unusual. His political enemies would use it to paint him as deviant, unstable, unfit for the title he bore. But worse, far worse, was what it would mean for Eleanor herself. If the letter was found, if her name was connected to his, the king's justice would not distinguish between a duke's infatuation and a servant's involvement. She would be questioned, tortured perhaps, certainly dismissed from the castle that had become her refuge, cast out into a world that had no place for a woman of her circumstances. Edward pressed his hands against his face, and for the first time since his arrest, something approaching despair crept into his heart. He had thought himself protecting her by keeping his distance, by confining his feelings to unspoken glances and unfinished letters. Instead, he may have condemned her. A sound at the door interrupted his anguish. Not the heavy tread of guards, but something lighter, almost furtive. A scraping of metal against metal, and then the impossible, the door swinging open on silent hinges. Edward rose from his seat, his body tensing for whatever new torment his captors had devised. But the figure that slipped through the doorway was not a soldier or a torturer. It was Eleanor. She wore the rough clothes of a kitchen servant, her dark skin shadowed by the hood of a worn cloak, but even in the dim light of the single candle she carried, Edward recognized her instantly. Her presence struck him like a physical blow, equal parts terror and wonder. "My lord." Her voice was barely a whisper, and yet it filled the small cell with a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying fire. "We have very little time." "How?" Edward's voice cracked, rusty with disuse and thick with emotions he could not name. "How are you here? This is impossible." Eleanor moved to him with a grace that seemed incongruous in their desperate circumstances. She reached into her bodice, a gesture that caused heat to rise in Edward's face despite everything, and withdrew a bundle of papers. "Your letters," she said. "I took them from the compartment before the soldiers could find them. All of them, my lord. Including..." She faltered, and in the flickering candlelight, Edward saw a flush darken her cheeks. "Including the one you wrote about me." The silence that followed was absolute. Edward stared at the papers in her hands, at the face of the woman who held his fate and his heart's confession in her keeping. He should have felt shame, exposure, vulnerability. Instead, he felt something he had not experienced in months of political maneuvering and royal standoffs. He felt seen. "You read it," he said. It was not a question. "I read it." Eleanor's eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not servile deference, not pity, not the calculated interest of a woman recognizing an opportunity. He saw tears, he saw truth, he saw reflection. "Every word," she whispered, "and every word, my lord, I have felt for you in return. The world beyond the cell walls, the guards, the trial, the king's wrath, the impossibility of their stations, seemed to fade into insignificance." Edward reached out, his hand trembling in a way it had never trembled before battle or negotiation, and touched her face. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers. Real, present. A miracle standing before him in a prison cell. "You should not be here," he said, but his thumb traced the curve of her cheek as if memorizing its contour. "If they find you, they will not find me." Eleanor's voice carried a strength that belied her circumstances. "I have been invisible my entire life, my lord. It is perhaps the only advantage my position has granted me. I move through the world unnoticed, and tonight I have used that invisibility to reach you." "But why?" Edward's voice cracked on the question. Why risk everything? Your safety, your position, your life? For a man who has done nothing but watch you from afar? Eleanor's hand rose to cover his, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. Because you saw me, she said simply. In a world that looks through me as if I were made of glass, you saw me. You wrote of me as though I were a woman worth writing about, not a curiosity, not a possession, not a body to be used and discarded. A woman. That letter. Those words about my eyes, about my grace, about your heart choosing. They were the first time in 17 years that anyone has seen me as human. You have always been human. Edward's voice was fierce now, burning with an intensity that surprised them both. More human than half the nobles who populate the king's court, more worthy of respect than any of the painted ladies whose families scheme for my hand. And yet the world would never permit us to... The world. Edward spoke the words like a curse. The world has brought me to this cell because I refused to marry a woman I despise. The world would have me executed for the crime of possessing principles. What has the world's permission ever given me but chains? He took both her hands in his, the stolen letters crackling between their intertwined fingers. Eleanor, I may die in this place. The trial will be a farce. The verdict is already written in the king's displeasure. But before I face whatever judgment awaits, I need you to know that those words in that letter were the truest I have ever written. I love you, impossibly, inappropriately, against every law of God and man that governs our stations. I love you. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, tracing silver paths down her dark cheeks. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Then do not die, my lord. Live, fight, and let me help you. She pulled back, and suddenly the servant girl was replaced by someone else, a strategist, a thinker, a woman whose hidden talents blazed in her eyes. The letters you wrote to your allies, I have read them too. The Earl of Northumberland, the Baron of the Welsh Marches, others who share your resistance to the king's tyranny. They believe you arrested alone, your cause silenced. But if word could reach them, it cannot. Every message I attempt to send is intercepted. Your messages, yes. Eleanor's smile was small but brilliant. But who intercepts the correspondence of a kitchen maid? I have contacts, my lord. Others like me, servants, invisible people, a network of those who pass messages for coin or kindness. I can reach your allies. I can coordinate your defense. I can do what the Duke of Ashworth cannot do from his prison cell. Edward stared at her, wonder replacing despair. You would do this? You would risk execution for treason? I would risk anything, Eleanor said, for the only man who ever looked at me and saw something worth loving. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the cell walls. Outside, the distant bells of London marked the passage of midnight hours. In the corridor beyond, a guard's footsteps approached, then receded. I must go, Eleanor whispered, but I will return. And when I do, it will be with news of your salvation. She pressed her lips to his hand, a gesture that burned through Edward like fire. And then she was gone, slipping through the door and into the shadows as though she had never been there at all. Edward stood alone in his cell, his hand still warm where her lips had touched it, and for the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to hope. The weeks that followed were a masterwork of shadow diplomacy. Eleanor moved through London like water through cracks in stone, unseen, unstoppable, reshaping the landscape through which she flowed. She carried messages sewn into the hems of her skirts, whispered secrets in market squares where servants gathered to gossip, and built alliances among the forgotten people who kept the great houses of England running. The network she assembled was unlike anything the nobles of the realm could have imagined. Kitchen maids who overheard their masters' conversations, stable boys who noted which horses carried urgent riders, washerwomen who recognized crests on soiled linens, invisible people, all of them, moving through the world of the powerful without ever being acknowledged as part of it. And at the center of this web sat Eleanor, coordinating information with a precision that would have impressed the king's own spy master. Her first message reached the Earl of Northumberland within a fortnight of her visit to the Tower. It was carried by a traveling tinker who owed Eleanor's network a debt of gratitude, and it contained not only news of the Duke's imprisonment, but a detailed account of the evidence, or lack thereof, that the Crown intended to present at trial. The Earl's response came back through a chain of servants that stretched across 3 counties. He would ride for London. He would bring witnesses to testify to the Duke's loyalty. He would not let his ally face the executioner's blade alone. Similar messages flew to the Baron of the Welsh Marches, to a sympathetic bishop whose diocese bordered Ashworth lands, to a merchant prince of Bristol whose fortune depended on the stability that the Duke's faction represented. One by one, the pieces of a counter-strategy fell into place. But Eleanor's most audacious move came not through messages, but through a conversation she engineered in the kitchens of Westminster Palace itself. She had secured temporary placement there through a connection, a cousin of Martha's who owed the head cook of Ashworth Castle a favor. And for 3 days, Eleanor scrubbed pots and carried trays while keeping her ears attuned to every whispered word. It was on the second night that she overheard what she needed. 2 of the king's advisers deepened their cups after a state dinner, discussing the upcoming trial in voices they assumed no servant could understand. "The evidence is thin," one admitted. "Refusing a royal command is hardly treason. If Ashworth's allies rally, the king may be forced to commute the sentence. Unless," the other replied with a knowing smile, "additional evidence were to emerge. Letters, perhaps, correspondence that proves conspiracy rather than mere defiance." "Do such letters exist?" "They exist if we say they exist. The Duke's study was thoroughly searched. Papers were seized. Who is to say what those papers contained?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. They intended to fabricate evidence, to forge letters that would transform the Duke's principled stand into a capital offense. She slipped away from her post that night, her mind racing. The letters she had taken from the Duke's study, the real letters, were hidden in a place only she knew. If she could produce them at the trial, she could prove that the Crown's evidence was false. But doing so would reveal her own involvement, would expose her to charges of theft, of conspiracy, of whatever crimes the king's men chose to invent. It would almost certainly mean her death. Eleanor thought of her mother, standing on that distant African shore, of the priest in Lisbon who had taught her that God's purpose was greater than circumstance, of Edward's eyes meeting hers in the firelight of his cell, of his voice saying words she had never thought to hear. "I love you." Some things, she realized, were worth dying for, and some loves were worth living for no matter the cost. If this story is touching your heart right now, pause for a moment, close your eyes, and leave a comment below with these words. Love sees what the world refuses to see. Write it now before you forget, because every comment becomes a prayer for those who love against all odds. The Great Hall of Westminster had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. Its vaulted ceilings had echoed with the pronouncements of kings and the pleas of the condemned. On the morning of the Duke of Ashworth's trial, it filled with nobles, clergy, and commoners who had gathered to witness what all assumed would be a foregone conclusion. Edward stood before the assembly in chains, his bearing unbowed despite weeks of imprisonment. He had been permitted to wash and dress in clothes befitting his station, a small mercy that he suspected was designed more to preserve the dignity of the proceedings than to honor his own. His eyes swept the crowd, searching for faces he recognized, allies who might have answered Eleanor's call. He found them. The Earl of Northumberland sat in the gallery, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him, the Baron of the Welsh Marches and half a dozen other nobles whose presence spoke louder than any testimony. They had come. Against the king's displeasure, against the risk to their own positions, they had come. But it was another face that made Edward's heart stop. A dark face half hidden beneath a servant's hood, standing in the shadows near the great doors. Eleanor had come too, and the sight of her filled him with equal measures of joy and terror. Lord Pemberton rose to present the Crown's case. His voice was oily with confidence as he detailed the Duke's refusal of the royal command, his treasonous correspondence with other nobles, his conspiracy to undermine the king's authority. "We have obtained letters," Pemberton announced, producing a bundle of papers sealed with wax. that prove beyond doubt the Duke's intention to raise arms against His Majesty. Letters that speak of alliances forged in secret, of troops promised, of a rebellion planned for spring. A murmur swept through the hall. Edward's jaw tightened. The letters were forgeries. He knew it with absolute certainty, for he had never written such words. But forgeries backed by royal authority carried the weight of truth. May the accused respond? The question came from the bishop who presided over the proceedings, his voice carefully neutral. Edward stepped forward, his chains rattling against the stone floor. "These letters are false," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "Fabricated by those who would see me dead, rather than allow my principled stand to inspire others. I have never conspired against the crown. I have only refused to marry a woman whose family represents the corruption that weakens our kingdom." "A convenient denial," Pemberton sneered. "But the evidence speaks for itself." "Does it?" The voice came from the shadows near the door. A woman's voice, clear and strong, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd with the precision of a blade. Eleanor stepped forward, pushing back her hood to reveal her face. A gasp rippled through the assembly, shock at her appearance, at her audacity, at the sight of a black servant woman daring to interrupt a noble trial. "Who is this creature?" Pemberton demanded. "Guards, remove her!" "I am Eleanor," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I am a servant of Ashworth Castle, and I hold in my hands the truth that Lord Pemberton would bury beneath his lies." She produced the bundle of letters she had carried since that desperate night in the root cellar. The real letters, bearing the real seals, containing the real words that the Duke and his allies had exchanged. "These are the Duke's actual correspondence," Eleanor announced, "taken from his study before Lord Pemberton's soldiers could find them. They speak of political disagreement, yes, of resistance to royal overreach, but nowhere do they mention rebellion. Nowhere do they speak of raising arms. The letters Lord Pemberton presents are forgeries, and I can prove it." The hall erupted into chaos. Pemberton's face contorted with rage. The king's advisors conferred in urgent whispers. And Edward stared at the woman he loved with an expression that mingled wonder, fear, and something that looked very much like awe. Eleanor walked forward, her step steady despite the trembling she must have felt within. She placed the letters before the bishop and met his gaze without flinching. "Compare the handwriting," she said. "Compare the seals. Compare the paper itself." The Duke's true letters were written on parchment from the Ashworth scriptorium, a particular quality with distinctive markings. Lord Pemberton's forgeries are written on common stock, available in any London market. The bishop examined the papers, his expression growing increasingly troubled. He called for experts, scribes who could analyze handwriting, craftsmen who could assess the quality of materials. The trial ground to a halt as the evidence was scrutinized. Hours passed. The crowd grew restless. And when the bishop finally rose to deliver his assessment, the silence that fell was absolute. "The letters presented by the Crown," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of his conclusion, "bear significant irregularities. The handwriting, while similar to the Duke's, shows marks of deliberate imitation. The seals, upon close examination, were cast from molds rather than pressed from genuine signet rings. And the parchment—" He paused, his eyes finding Lord Pemberton with an accusation that needed no words. "The parchment is of a quality that the Duke of Ashworth would never use for correspondence of this importance. The Crown's evidence appears to be fraudulent." The chaos that followed was like a storm breaking over the great hall. Pemberton tried to protest, to redirect, to salvage something from the ruins of his case. But the nobles in the gallery were already rising, their voices joining in condemnation of the Crown's tactics. The Earl of Northumberland called for Pemberton's arrest. The Baron of the Welsh Marches demanded an investigation. And through it all, Edward's eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, the servant woman who had just saved his life and destroyed her own anonymity in a single act of impossible courage. The Duke of Ashworth was released from custody 3 days after the trial's dramatic interruption. The king, faced with the public exposure of his advisor's duplicity, had little choice but to commute the charges. Lord Pemberton was stripped of his position and exiled to his country estates. The forged letters were burned in the Great Hall's fireplace, their ashes scattered as a warning to those who would pervert justice for political gain. But Edward's freedom came at a cost that weighed upon him as heavily as any chain. Eleanor had vanished. In the chaos following the trial, while nobles celebrated and advisors scrambled to distance themselves from Pemberton's disgrace, she had slipped away as silently as she had always moved through the world. Edward had searched for her, had sent his most trusted men to every corner of London, had questioned servants and merchants and anyone who might have seen a black woman traveling alone. Nothing. It was as though she had never existed, a ghost who had appeared only long enough to save him before dissolving back into the shadows from which she had emerged. Edward returned to Ashworth Castle in the grip of a despair that puzzled his household. He had won. He had defeated the king's machinations, preserved his right to choose his own bride, emerged from the tower with his honor and his head intact. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he wandered the corridors of his ancestral home like a man haunted, searching every face for features he would never find, listening for a voice that had fallen silent. It was Martha, the head cook, who finally broke through his isolation. She appeared at the door of his study one evening, her formidable presence filling the doorway, and spoke with the directness that had always characterized her interactions with the noble family she served. "You're looking for Eleanor," she said. It was not a question. Edward's head snapped up. "You know where she is?" "I know where she was." Martha's voice softened with something that might have been sympathy. "She came to me after the trial, told me she had to leave, that her presence here would only bring scandal upon your house. A duke cannot be seen to associate with a servant who interrupted a royal trial," she said. "It would destroy everything she had worked to save." "She was wrong." Edward's voice cracked. "She was wrong, Martha. I don't care about scandal. I don't care about what the court thinks or what society demands. I care about her." Martha studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. A wall coming down. A secret preparing to be shared. "There's something you should know about Eleanor," she said slowly. "Something she never told anyone, not even me, until the night she left." She reached into her apron and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Her father," Martha continued, "was not simply an African villager, as everyone assumed. He was a prince, the youngest son of a king whose realm stretched along the Gold Coast, educated by Portuguese traders, learned in languages and mathematics and the arts of governance. He was captured in a raid by a rival tribe and sold to slavers, a fate that befell many noble sons in those troubled lands." Edward took the paper with trembling hands. It was a letter, written in Eleanor's careful script. "My lord," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be far from Ashworth. Please do not search for me. What I did at the trial was necessary, but it has made me visible in ways that can only harm you. A duke cannot marry a servant. The world will not permit it, and I will not be the cause of your ruin after working so hard to prevent it. But I want you to know the truth of who I am, if only so you understand that your love was not misplaced on someone unworthy. My father was Prince Kwame of the Ashanti, third son of King Osei Tutu. My mother was the daughter of a chief whose lineage traced back 7 generations. I was born a princess, Edward, though the world stripped that title from me along with everything else. I tell you this not to claim a station I can never reclaim, but so that you might understand. When you looked at me and saw someone worth loving, you saw truly, not because of my blood, but because you saw past the circumstances that obscured it. You saw me. I will carry your love with me wherever I go. It will be my treasure, my secret wealth, the one thing that slavery could not take from me. And I will pray every night until my last breath that you find happiness with a woman the world will permit you to love. Yours, in this life, and whatever follows, Eleanor." Edward read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening the ache in his chest. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Where did she go?" Martha shook her head. She wouldn't tell me, said it was better if no one knew, so no one could be forced to reveal it. Edward rose from his chair with a determination that transformed his features from grief to resolution. Then I will find her, he said. If I have to search every village in England, every port in Europe, every corner of the world where she might have fled, I will find her, Martha. And when I do, I will ask her a question that the world has no right to answer for us. Spring had begun to soften the edges of winter when Edward finally found her. She was in Bristol, working in the household of a merchant who traded with the African coast, a man who had recognized her unusual origins and offered her a position that, while still servile, at least connected her to the world from which she had been stolen. She had taken a new name, tried to build a new life, but the shadow in her eyes spoke of a heart that remained in the north, in a castle she could never return to. Edward arrived unannounced, cloaked in traveling clothes that obscured his noble bearing. He had come alone without retinue or announcement, because what he had to say was not for public ears. He found her in the merchant's garden, tending to herbs that reminded her of her mother's healing arts. Her back was to him, but he would have recognized the grace of her movements anywhere, that particular way she held herself, as though constantly ready to fade into invisibility should the need arise. Eleanor. She turned, and the shock that crossed her face was followed immediately by a cascade of emotions he could not fully read: joy, fear, longing, resignation. My lord, she curtsied automatically, the servant's instinct overwhelming the princess within. You should not be here. Should not. Edward smiled, and it was the first genuine smile to cross his face in months. I have spent my entire life being told what I should and should not do. Should marry Lady Catherine. Should bow to royal commands. Should accept the forgeries that would have cost me my life. I find that I no longer have any patience for should. He stepped closer, and she did not retreat. I read your letter, he said softly. I know who you are, Eleanor, who you were born to be. A princess of the Ashanti, daughter of Prince Kwame, granddaughter of kings. A title that means nothing here. Her voice was barely a whisper. In England, I am a black servant, nothing more. In England, Edward replied, you are the woman who saved a duke's life, the woman who assembled an army of the invisible and used it to defeat the machinations of the crown, the woman who stood before the assembled nobility of the realm and spoke truth that none of them had the courage to speak. He took her hands in his, heedless of the garden's exposure, of the merchant's household that might be watching. In England, you are the woman I love, and I have not come here to ask you to return as my servant, Eleanor. I have come to ask you to return as my wife. The world seemed to stop. Eleanor stared at him, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. That's impossible, she breathed. A duke cannot marry. A duke can marry whomever he chooses if he is willing to pay the price. Edward's voice was firm. And I have already paid prices far greater than society's disapproval. I have paid the price of knowing what love is and watching it walk away. I will not pay that price again. The court will never accept it. The king owes me a debt, Edward interrupted. His advisors tried to have me killed with forged evidence. The scandal of that attempt has weakened his position with the nobles who supported my cause. He cannot afford to make an enemy of me now, and he knows it. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. I have spoken with the bishop who presided over my trial. I have secured the support of the Earl of Northumberland and a dozen other nobles who witnessed your courage. They will stand with us, Eleanor. Not because they believe in the propriety of our match, but because they believe in the debt they owe to the woman who exposed corruption in the king's own court. And the common people? Eleanor's voice trembled. The servants who will have to accept me as their mistress? The villagers who will see a black woman riding in the Duchess's carriage? Edward smiled, and there was something fierce in it, something that reminded her of the warrior who had led men at Agincourt. The common people, he said, have already heard your story. The tale of the servant girl who saved a duke has spread through every tavern and marketplace in England. They do not see scandal, Eleanor. They see a woman who proved that courage knows no station. They see hope. He released her hands and dropped to one knee, there in the Bristol garden with the spring sunshine falling around them like a blessing. Eleanor, daughter of Prince Kwame of the Ashanti, princess of a realm across the sea, savior of the Duke of Ashworth, will you marry me? Will you stand beside me and show the world what true nobility looks like? Will you help me build a house where love matters more than lineage, where a person's worth is measured by their heart rather than their birth? The tears that fell from Eleanor's eyes caught the sunlight, transforming into diamonds of joy that traced paths down her dark cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, and then stronger. "Yes." Edward rose and took her in his arms, and when their lips met, it was a seal upon a promise that would reshape the meaning of nobility in England forever. The wedding of Lord Edward Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ashworth, to the woman called Eleanor took place on a May morning, when the apple trees in the castle orchard were heavy with blossoms. It was not the grand affair that ducal marriages usually demanded. The king had declined to attend, and many noble houses had sent polite regrets rather than risk association with such an unconventional union. But those who came, and there were more than the gossips had predicted, witnessed something that would be spoken of for generations. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, commissioned from the finest dressmaker in London, its design incorporating subtle patterns that echoed the royal cloths of her Ashanti heritage. A circlet of gold rested upon her dark hair, and the diamonds at her throat had belonged to Edward's mother, the previous Duchess, whose portrait seemed to smile down upon the ceremony with approval. She walked down the aisle of the castle chapel with her head held high, and if she trembled, it was not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of the impossible becoming true. Edward waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers, and when the bishop asked if he took this woman to be his wife, his voice rang through the chapel with absolute certainty. "I do." And when Eleanor spoke the same words, there was a collective intake of breath from the assembly, the sound of a world shifting on its axis. They were married, a duke and a former servant, a Norman lord and an African princess. Two people whom every law of society declared should never have met, much less loved, much less joined their lives before God and witnesses. The years that followed would prove the wisdom of their union. Eleanor proved to be not merely a wife, but a partner in every sense of the word. Her education, hidden for so long, flowered in the freedom of her new station. She learned Latin and improved her French, corresponded with scholars and philosophers across Europe, and transformed the castle's modest library into a repository of learning that attracted visitors from distant lands. But it was her work among the common people that truly earned her the title the peasants themselves bestowed upon her, the greatest lady. She established schools in every village on Ashworth lands, ensuring that the children of farmers and craftsmen could learn to read and write. She created a system of loans for widows and orphans, funded by income from her own dower properties. She walked among her people not as a distant benefactress, but as one who had known suffering and emerged from it with compassion rather than bitterness. When illness struck the villages, Eleanor worked alongside the healers, drawing upon the medical knowledge her mother had taught her before the slavers came. When disputes arose, she sat in judgment with a wisdom that won respect even from those who had initially doubted a black woman's right to authority. And when, 3 years after their wedding, she gave birth to a son, a child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's rich, dark skin, the celebration that swept through Ashworth lands was unlike anything the region had ever seen. The boy was christened William Kwame Blackwood, a name that honored both his English lineage and his African heritage. He would grow to become the 6th Duke of Ashworth, known throughout England as a just ruler and a champion of the common people's rights. But that is a story for another time. The summer of 1422 found Ashworth Castle transformed. The gray stone walls that had once seemed forbidding now rang with children's laughter. William and his younger sister Margaret, along with the offspring of servants and villagers who were welcome to play in the castle gardens without distinction of rank. Eleanor stood at the window of her private chamber, watching her children chase each other through the rose bushes below. Her hair, now threaded with silver at the temples, was arranged in a style that had become fashionable among the noble ladies who had once whispered about her, a small irony that never failed to amuse her. Edward appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin upon her shoulder. At 42, he remained strong and vital, though the gray at his temples matched her own. 10 years of marriage had not dimmed the fire between them. If anything, it had deepened into something richer, more sustaining. "You're thinking," he murmured. "I can always tell." "I'm remembering." Eleanor leaned back against him, savoring his warmth. "The root cellar where I hid your letters. The tower cell where I told you I loved you. The garden in Bristol where you asked me to be your wife. And the chapel where you said yes." Edward pressed a kiss to her hair. "Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the whispers, the battles we've had to fight?" Eleanor turned in his arms, her dark eyes meeting his gray ones with the same intensity they had held that night in the tower, 10 years and a lifetime ago. "How could I regret becoming who I was always meant to be?" she asked. "Not Eleanor the servant, or even Eleanor the African princess, but Eleanor the woman who loves and is loved in return. Eleanor the mother of children who will change the world. Eleanor, Duchess of Ashworth, who proved that the invisible can become unforgettable." She kissed him then, a kiss that held 10 years of shared struggle and triumph, of passion that had deepened into partnership, of a love that the world had tried to forbid and that had conquered the world in return. When they parted, Edward smiled, that rare, genuine smile that only she could summon. "The king's emissary arrives tomorrow," he said. "His Majesty wishes to discuss the establishment of schools throughout the realm, modeled on the ones you've built here." "Does he indeed?" Eleanor's lips curved in satisfaction. "How times change." "Times change because people like you change them." Edward cupped her face in his hands. "You came to this castle as a servant, invisible to everyone, and now the king himself seeks your counsel. My father would say it's impossible." "And what do you say?" Edward's smile widened. "I say that I married the most impossible woman in England, and every impossible thing she does simply confirms the wisdom of my choice." Below, their children's laughter rose like music. The summer breeze carried the scent of roses through the open window. And somewhere in the village, the bell of the school Eleanor had founded rang out, calling the next generation of readers and thinkers and dreamers to their lessons. The Duke took his Duchess's hand and led her from the chamber, out into the sunlight of an afternoon that seemed to promise endless possibility. Behind them, on the wall of the private chamber, hung 2 portraits, one of Eleanor in her wedding gown, regal and radiant, and one of Prince Kwame, painted from his daughter's memories, his African royalty preserved forever in oils and gold leaf. 2 lineages, 2 worlds, one love that had defied them both and emerged victorious. And in the annals of Ashworth Castle, in the histories that would be written, and the stories that would be told around fires for generations to come, the name of Eleanor, the greatest lady, would shine brighter than any who had come before her. Not because she had been born to greatness, but because she had chosen it. If you watched until here, it's because this story truly touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. And if you haven't yet subscribed, now is the moment, because every week, stories like Eleanor's come to life here. Stories of impossible love, of courage against all odds, of hearts that refuse to surrender to a world that tells them no. Subscribe now, join this family of dreamers, and never miss another tale. If this story moved you, leave a like. It helps more than you know, spreading these stories to others who need to hear them. And share this video with someone who believes in love, in justice, in the triumph of the invisible. Because stories like Eleanor's deserve to be told again and again, until the whole world understands that true nobility has nothing to do with birth and everything to do with the choices we make. From which city and country are you watching? Tell me in the comments. Let us transform this space into a gathering of kindred souls from every corner of the earth, united by our love for stories that heal, that inspire, that remind us what it means to be human. Until the next tale, may you carry Eleanor's courage in your heart.